Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for day 5 of Mystery Week. This is our last video of the week. I'd like to thank you all so much for tuning in every day and for supporting me, and also for 100,000 subscribers. I cannot tell you how much it means to me. Today's case is one that a few of you have asked to hear, but also I think equally a lot of you have probably never heard of this before. It's a case that you'll find on every single list on Google that's world's creepiest unsolved mystery, world's creepiest murders. This one is always on there. A group of teenagers go camping by this beautiful picturesque lake in Finland, almost the perfect setting for a horror movie, and then they actually get brutally murdered. Our story begins on June 4th, 1960 at Lake Bodom in Finland, and here's my usual disclaimer when I cover a foreign case. My pronunciation and accent, as always, is just terrible. It's terrible with most languages. Finnish, I don't stand a chance. So I'm going to be saying them how I'm pretty sure they're supposed to be pronounced, but it's still probably wrong. So I'll be putting all names and important information on the screen so you can read it and see how it probably should be pronounced. 4 teenagers decide to go camping at the shore of Lake Bodom, which is a lake by the city of Espoo, which is about 22 kilometres outside of Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland. It was and still is a really beautiful lake, and the local teenagers would hang out there all the time. There was quite a lot to do. There was camping, different trails you could take, fishing, and even now it's still a really popular hangout place despite what had happened. But before 1960, this was just a really nice picturesque place to spend your day. So the 4 teenagers in question are 15-year-old Mela Emerli Bjorklund. I am actually pretty sure she's known by her middle name Emerli, so that's what I'm going to call her throughout this. And Anja Maki, as well as their 2 18-year-old boyfriends. So there's Anja's boyfriend Seppo Boisman and Emerli's boyfriend Nils Gustafsson. The teenagers thought nothing of it when they decided to go camping for a night, and they chose a really popular campground right on the shore of the lake. Anja and Seppo had been dating for about a year, but Nils and Emerli were actually quite a new relationship. They'd only been going out for a couple of months, and it was kind of like a double date kind of thing, but they were also just all friends who really enjoyed hanging out together. They arrived at the campsite on June the 4th, around probably midday, and they spent that entire day just having fun together, fishing, just enjoying each other's company. They did have a few drinks, of course they did. They were teenagers going off on their own. So they had a bit to drink, but they weren't hugely drunk. They were just teenagers having a bit of fun for the day. And obviously, as Finland is so far north, the sun would have set really late and risen really early the next morning. So the sun set that night at around 10:30 p.m. and they went to bed after this. And it would have risen very early the next morning as well, probably around 3 a.m. if not earlier. It was barely dark that night, but obviously they're all from Finland, so they were most likely very used to it being light most of the time in the summer. It wasn't until the early hours of June the 5th that things went wrong. Sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m, someone attacks the group, and this timing is later determined by the autopsy. An unknown person, or potentially more than one person, approaches the tent and cuts the lines which are holding the tent upright. So the tent would just fallen on all 4 teenagers, most likely waking them up. The 4 of them probably would have been startled and would start trying to figure out a way to get out of the tent, but the killer started attacking them. The attacker starts bludgeoning and stabbing the teenagers through the fabric of the tent, so they would have had no idea what's going on. All they would have felt is this fabric over them and them just being attacked. We know the killer had some kind of knife on them, but we also don't know what the other object is that they used to bludgeon the teenagers. It's thought it was probably a rock or a lead pipe or something just blunt. At some point, Emerli and Nils actually managed to get their way out of the tent, or they were removed by the attacker. Anja and Seppo never make their way outside of the tent, and they're found still underneath the fabric. Emerli, Seppo and Anja were all murdered at the scene, extensively stabbed and bludgeoned by this unknown person. Nils was actually the only person who managed to survive the attack. Nils himself still had pretty extensive injuries. He had injuries all over his face. His face was pretty much fractured in multiple places. He was covered in bruises. He was hit in the back and the front, and obviously had a really bad concussion as well. Nils was obviously made unconscious, meaning that he couldn't go off and find help for the rest of them. He was found at the same time as everyone else. A group of younger boys later came forward to say that around 6 a.m. they were bird watching at the lake, and they actually recalled seeing this tent. The tent sort of collapsed, and they remembered seeing somebody lying on top of the tent, but they didn't think anything of it. They were were quite young, so I don't think their minds immediately went to something bad had happened. They just saw somebody asleep on top of the tent and thought they'd fallen asleep whilst watching the stars. But the boys were actually not interested in the scene. They were more interested in the motorcycles that the teenagers had ridden up to the campsite. The true extent of the scene wasn't discovered until 11 AM when a man was jogging around the lake. This man was called Risto Siren, and he's the one to find the bodies and to find Nils still alive. He alerts the police, but he would have had to have left the scene to do this because he would have had to go to a payphone, and the police actually arrive around midday. The police found the crime scene absolutely baffling, and they struggled to put together the details of what had happened. Like I mentioned previously, Nils was found lying on top of the collapsed tent, but his injuries prevented him from running off to actually find help. His girlfriend, Emily, was found lying on top of the tent next to him. Some sources say that she was fully out of the fabric, some sources say she was still like half in the tent and half out, but she actually had the worst injuries of the group. She was by far the most brutally attacked. She was undressed from the waist down, and she'd been repeatedly stabbed and bludgeoned more than the others. Now, I actually couldn't find any reference to whether she'd been sexually assaulted at all. I suppose this was 1960, so they don't like advertise things like that in the newspapers. But if there are any Finnish viewers who know if she was sexually assaulted or not, I would really appreciate it if you could let us know down below, because I couldn't find out. Obviously most of the sources in this are in Finnish, and I can't even begin to translate Finnish. Even Google Translate does a really, really bad job with Finnish. The police, as you can probably guess, as is the case in most of these cases I cover, they were pretty incompetent. You see, brutal murders weren't something the police force in this area had to deal with pretty often, like pretty much ever. They rarely ever had any kind of murder to deal with, so they were very much out of their depth. Obviously, one of their first ports of call was to speak to Nils, who was the lone survivor of the attack, but he couldn't remember really what had happened. He said that he had a brief, very vague memory of an attacker dressed all in black and a flash of red, and then that's pretty much it. Obviously he had very extensive head injuries, he was concussed, so it makes sense that he wouldn't really be able to have any memories of this. As word spreads about what's happened, all of the locals come out to volunteer and help the police force look for clues. And the police actually let them do this. The police let all of these sort of public volunteers come to the crime scene, to the surrounding area, and just like trudge through all of the woods. Obviously it's really thick trees, thick woodland, and they're looking for clues, which may seem helpful, but when you're not securing a crime scene properly, things are going to get destroyed. And I don't even want to think about the amount of evidence that may have been missed or destroyed because all of the public were volunteering to help and they were just everywhere. But sealing the crime scene wasn't a huge priority for the police because they just never did it. They never properly sealed this crime scene. They never even like wrote down any details. They just sort of like looked at it. A few photos were taken, which I'll insert now, and then they let people come in and clean up, and that was kind of it. Neither of the murder weapons, the knife and this unidentified blunt object, have ever been recovered. The strangest thing about this case, it just seemed like the attacker went up to the tent, cut the lines, and then just randomly started like slashing at the fabric. They weren't like necessarily like aiming for anyone, they were just like slashing at the fabric until they hit a person. One of the things the police did notice about the scene though was that there were some unusual objects that were missing, including the keys to the victims' motorcycles. Like all the keys were gone, but the motorcycles were still there. So it wasn't a robbery, they weren't attacking them to take away the motorcycles, they were still there. The wallets were reportedly gone, which I saw in a couple of sources, but other sources had no mention of that. There were multiple items of clothing that were also gone, including Nils' shoes. Now these shoes were actually found anywhere from half a mile to a mile south of the camp, depending on which source you want to believe. When they were found, they were absolutely covered in blood, which suggested they were taken after the murder and not before. And whoever had taken these shoes would have to like walk down this very like windy path through the woods to get to this particular location to leave these shoes. The police found it very strange if somebody was trying to escape this crime scene that they'd go to the effort of walking down this really oddly windy path rather than take other more straightforward routes away from the area. A couple of sources did say that alongside the shoes being here there were a couple of other items of clothing as well, but again I can't be 100% sure on that. A month after the attack, when Nils was recovered from his head injuries, he was actually hypnotised to see if he could uncover any more memories about the attacker. And he did. He gave quite an interesting description whilst under hypnosis. But of course it is hypnosis, so it is to be taken with a pinch of salt. People become very suggestive when they're under hypnosis. So somebody could have been like suggesting things to him and he could have just been like, oh yeah, that is what I saw. Apparently though, the questions that Nils was asked in this particular hypnosis session were pretty open-ended. But yeah, hypnosis is always something that you can never like take for gospel. Nils described his attacker as a mid-sized man with a round face and long blonde hair, and it doesn't specify anywhere exactly how long meant. I don't know whether it means just like a little bit unkempt or like full-on long hair. It was a 60s, so I guess anything over a couple of inches probably considered long hair. He was blonde, but then again, so is about 80% of Finland's population. This man had big lips and he had acne on his forehead and his cheeks. They drew a variety of composite sketches of their suspect based off Nils' description, and to be honest, it's kind of terrifying. These photos, these like composite sketches, are really quite creepy. There's something about this guy they've drawn that just looks creepy. Also under hypnosis, Nils said that he actually tried to crawl out of the tent and the attacker kicked him in the face, which is how he got most of his injuries. And there was actually a man at one of the victims' funerals which apparently bore a striking resemblance to the man that Nils described as being the attacker. But I think people only noticed this after the fact because they were looking through photos, and I did see the photo actually on one source, so if I can find it again I'll link it here. I should have saved it, but I don't think I did. Yeah, this guy possibly, but then again it was 1960 photos, so they were like not the best quality. In the years since the attack, police have had other witnesses come forward. Apparently one person came forward and said they'd seen two young men fishing on the lake sort of very near the campground that night, and the police looked into this and they did find like several fish that were around this area as if they'd been eaten and sort of their corpses just thrown to the side. But these men have never been identified and they've never come forward. Although when he was under hypnosis, Nils did talk about how they all went to bed that night just after 10:30, but then him and Seppo woke up and they couldn't go back to sleep, so they decided to head out to the lake for a little bit to do some fishing, and then they headed back. Apparently Nils wanted to swim but he decided against it, so they just fished instead, and then they went back to the tent and went back to sleep and then were woken up by being attacked. So it's very, very likely that the two men that were seen fishing were actually Nils and Seppo. There of course have been many potential suspects over the years, with most local people believing it to be a man called Carl Valdemar Gillstrom. And I think this guy is actually known again by his middle name Valdemar, which is what I saw him being referred to as in most of the sources. Any Finnish viewers that I potentially have, I don't think I have many viewers from Finland, but if you happen to be watching this, can you let me know if like this is the thing? Do a lot of Finnish people just get known by their middle name? Because it made all the research for this very confusing. But he was also known to the locals as Kiosk Man because he ran a kiosk. He ran this small local kiosk, like this little shop for sort of fishing supplies, just snacks, things for people like around the lake if they just wanted to like get some food quickly. You could go to this kiosk and get some food. And it was well known that Valdemar hated campers, like with a burning passion. He hated them, and he was just known generally to not be that much of a great man. Apparently he would attach razor blades to the apples that he sold in his store, so he would prevent thieving, but also meant that like people would just pick up an apple and cut themselves. He would also throw rocks at children as they cycled past. Like he would stand outside his shop just throwing rocks at children just because he wanted to, because he could. So this isn't a great guy, and he actually ended up committing suicide in 1969 by throwing himself in Lake Bodom. Apparently during a drunken confession with a neighbour one day, Gillstrom actually confesses to the murders, which is kind of a big deal. But this wasn't the only person who had confessed. Like the police have had like multiple people come forward over the years and confess to being the one to kill the teenagers. And some of these people have been in prison, some of these people have been mentally ill. The police have always managed to like dismiss it somehow. But this guy, why would he just say to a neighbour when he's drunk that he's killed these kids? Like, why would you say it? He told his neighbour that he'd killed these kids and then stashed the evidence in a well on his property. And weirdly enough, just a couple of months later, he actually filled the well in, so nobody could get into this well anymore because it was just concrete. Many people believe that this is where he hid the murder weapons and the other items that he took from the campsite. Now the police did search his property, but they never found anything incriminating, but they didn't search the well because it was filled in. But they've never like tried to search the well, they've never like got any search warrant, they've never dug it up, they've just never bothered to search it. I mean, the police did look at this guy in relation to the murders, like he definitely was a dodgy guy, but they were sceptical of the fact that he actually did it because they said that he was considered disturbed or mentally ill. But I don't understand why him being considered disturbed would make him any less likely to commit the murders. If anything, it would make him more likely to commit the murders. Some witnesses apparently even came forward to the police to say like they'd seen him walking back from the area around the campsite on the day of the murders, but still the police didn't really do much about him. And because they'd spoken to his wife and his wife had given him an alibi, his wife basically said that he was asleep next to her all night, and the police just kind of believed this and never properly questioned Gillstrom. But interestingly enough, years later on her deathbed, his wife actually confesses to making up the alibi. She lied to the police because he threatened her and said like if she didn't do it he would kill her. And she thinks he did it. So all in all, I think Gillstrom is a very, very strong suspect, but he wasn't the first suspect the police looked at. The first guy they looked at came onto their radar on June 6, 1960, so the day after the murders. And this is in the form of a man called Osman Osman. I'm pretty sure that's maybe it is how it's pronounced in Finnish, and it just doesn't have the same meaning. Assmann, but Osman, I don't really know. I'm just going to call him Hans. He was an alleged KGB spy and a former Nazi. He was a former guard at Auschwitz, so he was like a proper Nazi. On June 6th, apparently he actually goes into Helsinki Hospital, which obviously was just a few miles away from Lake Bodom. And he goes to the hospital, he's got black dirt under his fingernails and he's covered in red stains, something red. The hospital staff said this guy was just overall acting very, very strange. He definitely looked like a bit of a mess. But whenever the hospital staff tried to deal with him, he was either like nervous and agitated, or he'd get really angry, or he'd just like feign unconsciousness. He'd just pretend to be unconscious when it was quite obvious that he wasn't. The police did question him, but apparently this guy had a very solid alibi, but I couldn't find anywhere what this particular alibi was. And this meant that it was enough for the police to just completely dismiss him as a suspect. But this guy was a very good suspect in my opinion. He lived very close to Lake Bodom. He obviously had a very violent past, hello, like former guard Auschwitz. And he was also suspected in other murders. But the police decided not to look into it any further because he had apparently a very strong alibi. But the hospital staff insisted that this guy came in covered in blood, but he had no cuts on him. So even if he didn't like commit these murders at the lake, he'd done something because he was covered in blood. It's suspected that Hans actually got away with what he did because he had very strong political connections because of sort of KGB, and that was kind of it. They got in contact with the police and were like, leave this guy alone, so the police did. One of the doctors that actually examined him that day went on to write a book all about why this guy was definitely guilty, and a former detective also connected him to up to 5 other homicides in the area. Hans had long blonde hair, and on the day after the murders he actually cuts all of his long blonde hair off. Whilst Gillstrom has always been locals' favourite suspect, Hans Osman has actually always been the public's favourite suspect in this, up until 2004 that is. They basically reopened the case in 2004 after 44 years, claiming that advanced technology had meant that new blood evidence was actually found on the shoes. And they also said that another woman had come forward saying that she had witness testimony from that night, which I always find odd because why would it take you 44 years to come forward? 44 years. All of this new evidence apparently pointed to a brand new suspect in the case, Nils Gunderson, the lone survivor. Now, Nils wasn't somebody that anybody had ever thought of as a suspect before. He was always the victim. But when the police actually turned around and said, like, he is our #1 suspect, they said that he's been the suspect, like the #1 suspect from the very beginning, which I find very hard to believe. So in late March 2004, Nils is actually arrested. And in 2005, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation declared that the case was officially solved based on all of this new evidence. Nils was in his 60s at the time, and he was arrested and put in jail pending his trial. The trial started on August 4th, 2005, with prosecution calling for life imprisonment. Now bear in mind, at this point, Nils had already been in jail for like well over a year, just waiting for his trial. And the prosecution's argument was weak at best. They basically said that the shoes were the key to the answer here. So new forensic analysis meant they were able to look at the shoes again, and they realised that blood on the shoes came from all of the suspects, but not from Nils. They argued that this made it pretty obvious that he was the one who did it because he murdered the rest of them, hid his shoes, then went back to the camp and inflicted the injuries on himself. And they basically told a story of what they thought had happened that night. They said that all of the teenagers had been drinking the night of the murder, and Nils supposedly flew into a rage because he thought that Seppo was maybe flirting with his girlfriend. The teenagers all kick Nils out of the tent and a fight begins with Seppo. And apparently Seppo punches Nils in the face and Nils flies into this rage and ends up murdering all three of them. They claim this story is backed up by their brand new witness, this woman who came forward claiming that on the night of the murder she was actually camping nearby and two teenage boys, Nils and Seppo, had entered her tent and they were behaving aggressively to her. And then they left and went back to the tent, and this when prosecution said that him and Seppo got in a fight and Nils ended up murdering them all. But I have got to really question this woman's testimony here. Like, why would it take you 44 years to come forward? Why would you not say this immediately? The defence just completely dismissed these stories because, to be honest, it is pretty unbelievable. Mainly because Nils was so badly injured that he laid there unconscious until he was found at 11 AM. And there's no way he could have inflicted the kind of injuries he had to himself. And this is backed up by the fact the shoes were found a mile away, because if Seppo had inflicted these injuries on Nils would have been unconscious pretty much there and then. He was in a really bad state. I mean, he wasn't dead, but he was in a very bad way. There's no way he would have been able to walk a mile round trip to hide these shoes and then walk back, and then he would happen to just collapse. It just wouldn't happen. Plus, I'm sure if that was the case, there's no way that Nils would have been able to keep his blood off of the shoes. When Nils was found, he was unconscious. He was barely able to move. He wasn't able to run and get help for anyone. He had just literally laid there all night. So either he's a very, very good actor, or he was very badly injured, and it's most likely the latter. From everything I could read, it didn't look like Nils had any sort of history of violence before this. He wasn't a particularly violent person. In the rest of his 44 years on Earth, he'd never got himself into any more trouble, really. So why would this guy just fly off a handle one night, murder 3 people, and then go on to live just a very decent life? During his trial, Nils was asked by a reporter how he knew he was innocent if he couldn't remember anything from that night. And he simply replies with, "I'm innocent, that's that." Finally, on October 7th, 2005, after spending over a year in prison, he's actually found not guilty and he's acquitted of all charges. On his acquittal, the state of Finland actually paid him 44,000 euros for the mental suffering caused by this entire trial. The Finnish authorities pretty much just had to back down and admit they were wrong on this and that they owed him some sort of compensation. And Nils actually did also try to sue Finnish newspapers for defamation of character, but he wasn't allowed to do this. He was denied permission to do so. This is a case that very much divides opinion in Finland. Half Finland thinks he's guilty, half think that he's definitely innocent. And honestly, at this point, I think it's really unlikely that this case is ever going to be solved. I think most cases are solvable, but this one, they've reanalyzed the evidence, they've looked at everything again, but at the end of the day, the police didn't look after the crime scene properly. They didn't probably find all of the evidence they needed to find. It's just a really weak case. If they even were to find somebody who they thought 100% did it, I doubt they would have enough to actually prosecute them. And that is the story of the Lake Bodom murders. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I've actually done 5 different cases this week from 5 different countries. 1 Canadian, 1 USA, 1 UK, 1 French, and 1 Finnish case, which I'm quite proud of myself for doing. I sort of set out to do things that were a little bit different this week, and I hope that I have, and I hope that you guys have liked this being different this week. As always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you click the subscribe button down below and leave all your comments, and I will see you in my next video, which will be on Monday. Okay, bye guys.